Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading into the deep woods for a collection of truly disturbing stories. But before we do, if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe for new videos every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. And if you really like scary stories, why don't you download our app, link in the description, for over 3,500 scary stories to listen to non-stop. But for now it's time to get comfortable. Grab your flashlights and let the darkness take control. I've been running in these woods for as long as I can remember, but this might make me change my mind. The story begins at 6:30 p.m. I had finished eating and decided to go on a run as usual. I always use the same path, cross the street, run for about 1 kilometer, and pass the gate that goes into the woods. Something important to note is that the trail I use in the forest is separated about halfway through. The path is paved, and the other isn't. I usually go on the unpaved path first and then turn onto the paved one after about 3 kilometers. Nothing ever really goes wrong. I meet some rare people walking their dogs, but other than that, I'm pretty alone. At least I thought I was. I had been running for a while now when I heard a notification coming from my phone. Airdrop. Since I didn't want to make it look like I was worried, I kept running for a few minutes and then stopped to change the music. I opened the airdrop with dread. Who the hell was sending me stuff? I was pretty sure I was alone. I clicked on the drop and my heart sunk. It was a Snapchat picture of me running with the caption, "You look good." I didn't turn around. Instead, I kept running like nothing happened until I reached a certain point. You see, the forest is surrounded by a fence to stop children from coming in unsupervised, and I didn't like that rule when I was little, so my friends and I cut a hole in it. When I was aligned with that hole, I quickly turned and buried myself into the forest, aiming for my escape. I could hear ruffling behind me, and I still didn't turn back. When I finally reached the hole, I jumped through it and absolutely booked it to the first fire station that was a few streets down. The last thing I could hear when leaving the forest was an angry huff and metal meeting metal. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted from me, but I never ran in the forest again. So creepy stalker guy or murderer or whatever you are, I truly hope I never meet you again. 17 or 18 years ago, my fiancée, now wife of nearly 16 years myself, and one of the couple were hiking the Pyramid Point hiking trail in the Sleeping Bear Dunes of the northwest lower peninsula of Michigan at dusk. We had my old film camera with a 200mm zoom lens on it. We got to the overlook, which looks northwest, over Manitou Passage to the Manitou Islands, and watched the sunset, and entered that late dusk period that seems to last forever during a northern Michigan summer. It was probably 10 p.m. at this point. There were high winds and solid waves breaking on shore below us. The Pyramid Point overlook is maybe 150 to 200 above Lake Michigan, but it didn't look any rougher than many evenings on Lake Michigan, where 5-meter breaking waves are fairly routine, and windy nights and crashing waves provide great white noise for sleeping in a tent. As we were camping elsewhere, there's no camping at this trail. While standing and talking, we saw a light flash once out in the water between the island and the mainland, in the vicinity of the North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse, a crib lighthouse standing alone in the water, not inhabited or staffed, but tempting for visitors, I would assume. We stopped and looked, but weren't creeped out by it at all. After all, boaters are out in this stretch of water fairly regularly, though not in high winds and waves. I grabbed my camera to look through the zoom lens and make out what appeared to be a small boat, though it was difficult to tell with the 200mm lens. It was a 7-mile wide stretch of water to the nearest island, so we were probably 3 to 4 miles away from the actual light source. We had flashlights, so we shined our lights, which from several miles away might not have even been visible. We waved the flashlights in the direction of the light we'd seen. Immediately it came back and started flashing SOS in Morse code, which was a huge surprise to us. We weren't even sure our lights were bright enough to be seen at that distance, and given that the stretch of shore is almost all forested, we were at a little spot several miles away. Suddenly, we were full of concern and adrenaline. Two of us ran back to the car, which is half a mile through the woods in the dark down a hill with our flashlight, and got a cell phone and binoculars. While we were gone, the folks on the lookout had no light source. At the car, we called the Coast Guard from our cell phones. Bear in mind this was 1999, so these weren't smartphones by any stretch of the imagination. We explained to the Coast Guard that someone was flashing SOS out in the water, and that we were hikers observing this from the Pyramid Point overlook. They said they'd send a ship to look over the area, and we asked them to hurry. At this point, we ran back up to the overlook with binoculars, our phone, and our flashlight. It's about half a mile and a steep hill. Atop the overlook, there was no cell signal, so we had to pocket the phone and had no further communication with the Coast Guard. Our binoculars were able to see a guy in an aluminium rowboat, rowing like crazy with waves breaking over the bow of his boat. It was nearly pitch black outside, so we were only barely able to make this out. At about 10:30 or 10:45, at this point during a Michigan summer, it's still light enough to see out well. He would occasionally turn around, flash SOS at us, and go back to rowing. It was disturbing to be several miles away from a completely helpless person as we watched him struggle in the rowboat in the dark. As you can imagine, darkness fell. He could not see anything more, and every few minutes the man in the rowboat would flash SOS at us. He did not appear to be making any progress towards the mainland, but he was clearly drifting northwards through the Manitou Passage. Every time he'd flashed, we'd turn on our flashlight, shine it back at him for a few seconds and turn it off. We did not know Morse code, and we had no cell signal. We stood on watch for what seemed like forever, completely helpless. The man stopped flashing his light. It was too dark to see the boat. A tugboat that didn't appear to be the Coast Guard ship showed up and started doing a grid search pattern through the passage with bright lights shining from boat to water. The Manitou Passage is probably 6 to 7 miles wide and 6 to 7 miles long, so it was a slow search. A smallish Coast Guard ship started doing searches on the northern end of the straits, also with bright lights. They met in the middle of the strait, having done a zigzag pattern for what felt like an eternity. Then they sailed off. They did not appear to find anyone. We drove into a bar in Glen Arbor to see if there was anything on the news, and there wasn't. We called the Coast Guard the next day, wondering if we'd seen a man die, or helped to rescue, or neither. But the person on duty had no idea what happened due to shift change, or that we'd even called the night before. To this day, it's unsettling to me, knowing how harsh these conditions can be on Lake Michigan, and knowing that we'd seen a man flash SOS at us through our binoculars. Just before it got dark, it was really bothersome, though not as bothersome as the poor guy in the boat, who had to wonder why we weren't doing anything for him. No closure, no happy or sad ending, no ending at all really, other than going back to our camp and hitting the sack. I often wonder about that guy. I hope he was found. About 25 years ago, I went hiking in Fossil Falls, just outside of Ridgecrest, California, with some friends. Once we hiked down the falls, we got to the opening of the canyon and started smelling what smelled like something dead. As we walked on, the smell got stronger, and we decided to find out what it was. We come upon an area where the smell is overpowering. On the surface of the ground in this area, there appeared to be a few oil slicks pulled at the top of the surface of the ground, which appeared to have been dug recently. We attempt to dig down about 6 inches, but the smell is beyond anything we can deal with. We decide to leave and call the cops. The cops get down into the canyon part of the fall, picks up on the smell and tells us it isn't a good sign. As we get closer, but not even the place where the smell is coming from, he starts to call a lot of reinforcements, cops, helicopters, etc. He told us that for something to generate that kind of smell, someone would have had to have buried a deer or something familiar to make it. When we called the cops to follow up on what happened, they told us it was just some chicken skin and bone. No human remains were found. The official story completely conflicted with what the cop, who had previously been a homicide investigator in LA, had told us. When I told a co-worker what happened, he reached out to a higher-up that he knew at the Department of the Forestry Service, and when he relayed the story, he was told, "How did you know about this? You shouldn't know about this, and those guys should forget about it immediately." My theory is that someone was killed and buried on government land, and they didn't want it to get out. There's no way in or out of that canyon unless by military access road from the China Lake Weapons Center. I recently went on a hike with my friend and his mini schnauzer at our local state park. We had gone on the trail several times before. It's very popular with hikers and families. It was late evening and getting dark, so we picked up the pace. Once it was dark enough to not be able to see where we were stepping, I turned on a little flashlight that my mum had given me just that day. She said that she was worried about me walking to my car after my late night classes, and told me to shine it in someone's face if there was anyone creepy, which I thought was silly. Bringing this flashlight was a total fluke, but I was happy to have it for the increasingly dark hike. We were about a 10-minute walk away from the edge of the forest, where we parked, when we encountered a lone male walking in the same direction as us about 100 yards ahead. He was a Caucasian in his mid-50s wearing non-hiking clothes. He was walking slowly, which was odd, because it was very dark and most hikers on the trail were long gone, and if not, they would be hurrying out of the woods. The man did not have a flashlight in the very dark forest. My finger slipped from the flashlight and it turned off for a few seconds. I turned it back on, and the man had stopped walking and was standing in the path ahead of us. He quickly moved to the side as soon as I turned the light back on, and said something into his cell phone while we continued forward towards him. As we walked by the man standing on the side of the path, our normally friendly dog barked and growled at the man. The only words we heard the man say were, "Ah, she's an ankle biter." He was suddenly not talking on his phone. I shined the flashlight in his direction while we walked by to know where he was located in these extremely dark woods. I had a really weird feeling about him and started jogging away with my friend. We ended up in a full run out the woods. As we were getting back to the car, we saw the man exit the woods maybe a minute after us and walk quickly towards us as we got in our car. He had to have been running because we ran the whole way out the woods and we're in our mid-20s. This guy was significantly older, so it would have required effort to run that far and fast for him. When we got to the car with the man still quickly approaching, I told my friend to floor it, and we got the hell out of there. A few years back, when I was around the age of 14 and my brother 9, my dad, my little brother and I went out deer hunting in the afternoon right before sundown. While we were walking through the woods, before we even got started, my little brother tugged on my arm and asked me if I saw that. I said it was probably his imagination, and he let go of my arm. A few minutes later, I couldn't hear him walking behind us anymore, and turned around to find he had gone. I quickly told my dad and we looked for him for at least half an hour. When he walked over out of nowhere towards the both of us, he was covered in mud like he'd fallen somewhere. I worriedly asked him where he'd gone, and he just stared at me, telling me he couldn't remember and thought that he had never left. He acted normally afterwards, just as though nothing had happened. I don't know if it's scary to anyone else, but it shook the entire family, including myself, for quite a bit. When I was a teenager, I used to sneak out of my house at night quite often. Sometimes just to ride my bike around, occasionally to meet up with friends that lived nearby. I live in a fairly suburban area, but with some decent stretches of forest road that would probably creep out some people. I wasn't bothered because of how frequently I was out at night, but I probably would be now. It was around this time of year, and where I live, that means it was very cold. I was supposed to meet up with a friend of mine, who lives about a mile away in a cul-de-sac neighborhood, and although he had stopped answering his phone because he fell asleep, regardless, I decided to head towards his house anyway, in case he woke up. We had planned a meeting time already. I was walking on a dark stretch of road at the beginning of his neighborhood, which has no houses, which I suspect is for drainage reasons, because while there are trees on the left, there is a recess clearing to my right, bigger than a football field, which is covered in thick brush. So I'm walking with my face halfway in my jacket due to the cold, and I'm looking at my feet as I walk. I'm approaching the only street light in sight, at which point I decide to look up and almost crap myself, because there's a deer standing directly in the road under the light, and even though I know deer are basically harmless, I'm still shocked, because I damn near walked into it. It's just standing there, the deer looking directly at me, and before I can react, I hear the roar, a sound only a wild cat would make. Some type of feline beast pounces out of the brush and bites this thing right on the neck, taking it down to the pavement. It looks up at me, and is so close it could have easily attacked me as well, or even instead of the deer. In some lightning speed decision making, I figure this thing has enough food and is probably not interested in eating me as well, and that, the best thing to do, is to run all the way back to my house as fast as possible. I didn't sneak out anymore after that. Almost every time I tell this story, people assume I was high or drunk and fabricated the whole thing because why would anyone else sneak out on a school night or do anything like that? I don't know why. Teenagers are weird, and even though I was dead sober, it was probably not by choice. I never figured out what kind of cat it was, and as you can imagine, I tried staying at home a bit more often after that. Perhaps to others, this following thing will not sound that scary, but given the context, perhaps you'll understand why I was a bit frightened at the time. I go for runs early in the morning. On one morning in particular, it's 5 AM and it was misty. I'm running with a flashlight strapped to my head. Suddenly, around the corner of this trail, remember, early morning, 5 AM, a whole group of fully packed men in camo run past me. The local university ROTC program was doing a morning run in full heavy backpack. They run with no lights, and in the mist, it felt like something out of a World War II movie. I was mountain biking. I have a few LED lights for night riding, a wide floodlight on my handlebars, and a narrow beam spotlight on my helmet. I'm in Florida, and was riding through a swampy jungle when I noticed the trail was covered with these little sparkly emerald green shiny things. I assumed they were quartz crystals or something, except the trails were mostly sand, and shouldn't have anything like that. So I decided to stop and see what the reflection was, and it was light reflecting back from the eyes of a giant wolf spider. The trail was literally covered with spiders, hundreds and hundreds of them, and these were the ones that were facing me. Another time on the same trail, I was flying down a long straightway, and up ahead I see a pair of eyes reflecting on the trail back at me. They were low to the ground, and I thought they were a raccoon or a possum or something. As I got closer, they started to rise up, and got up, and some more, until they were, it seemed, as tall as a person. Just as the creature got into range of my spotlight, it turned around and bolted into the trees. I only saw its back in my spotlight for a moment, but whatever it was big and covered in medium brown fur. I'm guessing it was a deer, but I'm not entirely sure given the shape. But as you can imagine, I wasn't going to stick around and find out. I have a rather big forest near my home. There's nothing special about it, neither creepy nor mystical, and not pretty either, just a forest with trees and bushes and so on. I used to go there a lot with my dog since it was conveniently close and he could run around on it while I was minding my own business. Around 2 or 3 years ago, I went there rather late, at around 9 PM, where it started to get dark soon, but I still wanted to go for a short walk. I always stay on track so I do not disturb any wildlife or damage the plants. As it's getting later and later, I'm somewhat in the middle of the woods, but I feel all good. I know every small track there, and I would always find my way back home. As I'm walking, I hear some weird noises rather close to my left. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was definitely nothing I've ever heard before. It didn't sound like anything earthly, as stupid as that may sound. Then, my dog comes bursting out of the bushes, his tail clamped between his legs, totally focused on me and desperate to get going. He knew there was something weird going on. As I try to calm him, I take a look into the woods, and there, maybe 20 meters from me, I see a pair of deep red eyes staring at me. No movement, no blinking, no anything. They just stare right at me. I'm struck, and somehow can't really move, but I keep staring into those eyes. They were seriously red. I don't know how to describe it, but again, nothing I have seen before. I knew that something there didn't belong, but I didn't know what it was. It was almost like I was dreaming. A very eerie feeling was in the air. It was dry and crisp as hell. And I also felt really calm for some reason, and just told my dog to follow me, and backed away slowly. I never looked back, but I know for sure if I had looked, the eyes would have still been staring at me. After a few meters, I suddenly woke up from my trance-like state, and it just hit me. And I begin full speed running with my dog through that forest, scared out of my mind. I'm crying big time while I'm running. I don't even know why, and what really happened. But everything just felt so freaking wrong, and I wanted to get as far away from there as possible. To this day, I don't know what I saw there that night, and I don't think I really want to find out. The only animals that live in that forest are deer and boars, but the eyes were at human face height, something between 1.5 meters to 2 meters. I never stepped foot into that forest again. It is now the territory of the unknown cryptid, but I haven't heard from anything weird going on down there either. I just want to make sure you understand, I didn't do any drugs or comparable things before going in. I'm pretty sure something weird or downright disturbing would have happened to me had I stayed in the forest. When my friends were 14 or so, they walked up into the woods behind our buddy's house. After walking out into the wilderness for probably half an hour, they came across a well-kept red-headed man. Without saying a word, he began walking at them and proceeded to chase them for about 2 miles, all the way back out of the woods. Once they got back into the clearing, he just turned around and walked back up into the wilderness. I worked with someone who vacationed in Japan and went for an early morning jog. He thought he was in a park, as it was relatively close to his hotel, except it was too nice a park to be a park. And then he was surrounded by an Imperial Guard, like a circle of men with guns wearing uniforms. I guess he somehow found a back way into the palace garden. He wasn't arrested, but laughed at mercilessly. Every year, me and one of my closest friends, called Dane, go down to visit his grandparents at their cabin in a nice small peaceful town in the North Georgia mountains. Me, my friend and his grandpa are all outdoorsy kind of people, so we are always looking for something fun to do around the area. One night, we decided to go on a night hike on a trail not too far from the cabin. Now, this isn't the kind of trail you're probably thinking of. It's really just a gravel dirt road, but a lot of hunters, campers, motorbikers and backpackers use it. And right as we pulled up to the trail we're going to hike on, we noticed an older, beat-up, suspicious-looking black Chevy SUV with two middle-aged men in it parked next to the entrance of the trail. Now, even though this is a safe area, drug deals and other kind of sketchy activities can occur deep in these woods, so we avoided going on that trail and decided to head down to another trail about half a mile down the road. We pulled about 50 or so feet into the trail just outside of view of the road, parked the truck, and got out and started our hike. Our hike was off to a great start, until we got about a mile in, and we started to hear a dog barking from about 300 feet away. We decided to keep going, but the dog would just not stop barking, and we didn't know if the dog was on a leash or not, and could come and attack us, so we decided to turn around and head back. When we were about 1,000 or so feet away from the truck, we could see a car sitting behind my friend's grandpa's truck, running with its headlights on. This instantly made us worried, because who would just roll up behind a random truck at 10 o'clock at night on an isolated trail? And keep in mind, you had to drive into this trail to see where we parked the truck. It was not visible from the road. We stood there for about 5 minutes trying to see if we could see anybody, but since it was so dark and pretty far away, it was hard to see anything. Fortunately for us, there was a pretty large tree next to the trail, and we were able to stand behind it, so there was no way they could have seen us from where they were parked. My friend's grandpa took these night vision binoculars we had with us to try and get a better look, but it was still not much help. We decided to just stand there and wait for them to turn around and leave, because there was no chance we were going to walk back with this random car with potentially bad people in it sitting behind our truck. After about 10 minutes of just standing there, to my absolute horror, the car drove around the truck and started to head down the trail in our direction. As soon as we could, we climbed up this high hill right next to us and hid behind a log that was sitting on the top. A few seconds later, the same beat-up black Chevy SUV we saw outside the other trail we were originally supposed to hike on comes driving down where we were just standing not 15 seconds prior. The car had rolled its window down and started to slow down as it drove past us. Me, my friend and grandpa were terrified. Our hearts were pounding out of our chests, and we were scared these guys would stop and sit there, or worse, get out and start looking for us. Fortunately, the car just kept driving and never stopped. As soon as the car was out of sight and we got out of our hiding spot, we booked it back to the truck and got the hell out of there. I know this may not be as scary as some other stories you've heard, but to us it was definitely very frightening. We didn't know who or what those guys wanted. My guess is that they had a stash on that deep trail in the woods, and thought that if we stumbled upon it or something, they would need to confront us, or perhaps end us. A lot of things could have gone wrong. We could have walked up to the truck just as they pulled in. What if they'd have come out and looked for us? What if they'd have slashed our tires? Or what if they turned their headlights off and sat there and waited for us to return? My friend and his grandpa actually went back in the daytime a few days later to the exact spot where we were hiding and took a few pictures. If we got up there just 2 seconds later, we would obviously have been seen. I can only imagine what could have happened if we didn't make it up that hill and those guys saw us. Your guess is as good as mine, but I'm relatively certain it would not have been good. About 100 meters elevated up the cliff. It's the middle of the day in summer. There's plenty of light and warmth, and after working my way ahead alone through some thicker forest that my wife didn't want to pass through, I came to a clearing covered in a thick layer of bleached shells, literally thousands of large shells 100 meters off a cliffside in the scrub. I started to look through the shells and filmed some of the videos to see if anyone on Instagram knew what would cause this phenomenon. I had picked out a nice shell that was still fully intact, and upon placing it in my pocket, I kid you not, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and it suddenly felt like midwinter. Paired with the sudden coldness, I have not felt something like that ever. I felt like I was surrounded by a multitude of spirits, and I got the feeling that I wasn't welcome there. The closest thing I could compare it to is what I imagine prey feels like before a hidden predator is about to come and pounce on it. I was suddenly and inexplicably in full fight or flight mode. I placed the shell back and hightailed it out of there, backed out the clearing, and I was instantly feeling fine. After some research and confirmation, the site would have been undiscovered Aboriginal middens, which is the word used for a collection of items, often the remains of leftover meals, from when Aboriginal communities lived in places a few hundred years ago, and in peace. I shared this story with my wife, but the site is so hard to access that I didn't bother telling many people. I have explored many creepy abandoned buildings in my time. Old abandoned buildings, derelict drive-in movie theaters, mental hospitals in the middle of the forest, but this one takes the cake for the sensation of me needing to get out there now. When I was around 14, I really liked to go for runs with my dog. It was a German Shepherd / Labrador mix, and I lived in a fairly quiet and clean suburban neighborhood that was situated besides a broad expanse of pasture used by about 10 horses, I would say roughly 40 acres. A bike path ran between the pasture and my neighborhood, and I generally ran down the path. One night I decided to go with my pup at around 10 p.m. May not seem like the smartest decision, but I had spent many nights with my group of friends biking or rollerblading around the neighborhood, so I thought nothing of the late hour. I was running down the bike path with my dog, who was a big pup yet the friendliest guy you'll meet. As we ran, I noticed a dark lump a little ways ahead, and because it was nearly pitch black I could barely see it. I dismissed it as a garbage bag, and as we drew closer my dog perked up his ears and his hackles went up as he started to growl, which he rarely does. He loves basically everything. I stopped running and stared at the garbage bag, which started to move. 14-year-old me still didn't really know what the heck I was looking at, and it wasn't until the supposed garbage bag stood up that I realized it was a man, who then began to run towards us. My dog then turned around, and I kid you not, started to run and yanked me along behind him. We reached a street. He darted down it, then pulled me into a dark alley on another street, then another alley, then another street, until we somehow lost the guy. I'm fairly certain my dog saved my life. The guy may or may not have been an axe murderer, but it turns out some creepy ex-felon was arrested in our neighborhood about 2 days later. What do you think? I'm fairly certain it was this guy. Who knows what he wanted to do with me? And all I have to say is that I love my dog. When I was 18, I dated a girl my parents did not approve of, and because of this I ended up moving out of my house and living in my car. Her house was in a very rural area, and so I would park my car at the entrance to an old field, walk across it, and through some woods to her house and hang out with her, then go back to sleeping in my car at night. This went on for several weeks. I never felt scared traversing the woods or the fields at night, at first, as my girlfriend's dog would follow me the whole way and then return home. But then came the night I reached my car, and the dogs had not followed me. I could faintly make out, in the distance to the north, the sound of drums. They were like tribal drums, the kind you hear in films during a ceremony or ritual, with a slow and steady beat. As I stood by my car listening, trying to identify what was happening, the realization hit me. About a mile or so to the north was located a cult on a dead-end road, and that's what I'd heard when I was a young teen. I didn't know what they were into exactly, but talk in my small childhood school had been of animal sacrifices and your typical creepy goings-on. My mind immediately seized upon that, and the obvious answer. They were doing some kind of ritual, and the sound was carrying through the thick woods that separated them from me. I got into my car and tried to get some sleep. A few hours later, I awoke to the sound of growling and something hitting my car from underneath. Dog, coyote, whatever. But after that happened, I was much more on edge crossing the woods and field at night. I heard the drums almost every night after that. Then one night, while climbing into my car, I looked out the windshield and saw a human shadow figure standing in the field I had just crossed, the form silhouetted against the lighter night sky. I was startled, but assumed it was my girlfriend's stepfather, who otherwise didn't know I was camping out there. Thinking he followed me and that my gig was up, I turned on my headlights to light up the field and face him. But when I did, the field was empty. I was so shaken by it that I drove away and slept in the parking lot of a country church. It wasn't long before I came to my senses and got away from that girl. That ended my experiences for a while. However, about a year later, I began attending a church about 30 miles away. I found out that the youth pastor actually lived about a mile north of where I had those experiences. In fact, the youth pastor lived on the dead-end road where the cult was located. When I found out, I asked her if she'd ever experienced anything paranormal from the cult. She told me the cult had actually been gone for about a decade, and she had moved onto the street a few years after they left. However, she began to tell me about her experiences when she first moved there, of hearing drums outside, and her young daughters talking about seeing the shadow people who ran around in the trees that encircled their property. I could not believe what I was hearing, for it clarified and verified what I had experienced. She then told me she had done some research on the history of the area and learned it had been frequented by Native American tribes due to a fresh spring nearby. So what I had assumed to be a cult, I now assumed to be some kind of paranormal event connected to them. Sometime later, I dated a girl who lived about 2 miles south of where I had had my experience. When I brought up what happened to me there, and the youth pastor's explanation of her experiences at her home, my girlfriend freaked out, telling me her mother would sometimes take a bottle of alcohol out into the woods, only to come back hours later drunk and insisting that she had been, in her own words, dancing with the Indians. We broke up not long after, but one night she called me terrified, asking me to come over because she was being attacked by an unseen entity that was shoving her around in her room. I drove over and gave her some inspirational music to put on. She asked me to stay until she fell asleep, and I sat there as she laid in bed. A shadow form appeared in her room, floating up near the ceiling in a corner and emanating darkness, like it was glowing black. Somehow I boldly faced up to it and prayed silently for it to go away, and in moments it just vanished. Then she spoke up, which was weird because I thought she was asleep, and asked if I had been praying. I told her I had, and she just confirmed that she knew something was there. We left it at that. I went home. It's been over 20 years since, and I've never experienced anything like that again. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. I really enjoyed reading these. Going into the deep woods can always be a little bit terrifying, depending on the context. I don't know if any of you remembered, but today is Pandora's 4th birthday. I know! Some of you may remember this, and it just goes to show how long we've been, telling and listening to stories together. It's really weird. I remember that this day 4 years ago I was super stressed because I had a collaboration the very next day with my then artist, Angeliki, and I was scared that I wasn't going to be able to make the video. And as it turns out, the day after, on Valentine's Day, when we got home, I did manage to finish the video. I think it was either one day late or went out on that same day. But yeah, man, those times were crazy. But yeah, 4 years today. Where has the time gone, guys? I can't believe it myself. Goodness gracious, where is the time going for real? I'd like to extend a huge thank you, as always, to my members and my patrons whose names can be seen on screen now. Your help is, of course, invaluable, and you guys are the best. Thank you so much for your continued help, support, and contributions. Couldn't do it without you. If you'd like to have your name shown at the end of the video and get some cool rewards, you can do that by clicking the link in the description to Patreon or Coffee or YouTube memberships. There are perks for doing so. It really does help me out, and it means a hell of a lot for you guys to do that, so thank you. I think I'm going to wrap things up here though, because just because. Stay awesome, guys. Thank you so much. Hopefully see you on... what is it today? Oh, Saturday. See you on Saturday. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.